Hi, this is Korean Choices in Criminology, a podcast describing the life stories of prominent scholars in criminology, created by Network Safe Places at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology. We would like to gain insights into their professional journeys, the factors and motivations behind their entry into the field of criminology, and their career accomplishments. We hope these interviews can serve as a source of inspiration for you who is a student or early career scholar. During these interviews, we aim to discover their past and present research passions. If you have comments or suggestions, please contact us via our website. Thank you and enjoy.
Hello everyone, my name is Jonathan Abraham and I am a PhD student at KTH Royal Institute of Technology and also part of the Urban and Community Safety Research Group. I'm currently at Philadelphia attending the annual meeting of American Society of Criminology, and I'm very glad to be able to present today's guest, Ralph Weisheit, who is a distinguished professor at Illinois State University, who is also a very prominent rural criminologist who studied policing and drug markets and drug production outside of the big cities. So yes, thank you very much for coming here and taking your...
Well, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Yep. So before we start, maybe we can give us a quick rundown of who you are.
I grew up in outside of a small town in southern Indiana, which is a state in kind of the middle part of the United States. And the town itself was probably 7,000 at that time. We lived outside of it, pretty much surrounded by farms. Although I was not a farm family, but my grandparents on each side of my family had small farms, and I spent a lot of time there. Grew up in that community, had really no one in my family had gone to college. I had a cousin who had gone just maybe 2 years before me, but it's not someone who taught me anything about what is college about, what do you do, how do you act, I didn't know anything about even applying for colleges, but I picked up a brochure for Indiana University, and I saw in the brochure they have 30,000 students. I said, oh, that sounds great. I'll go there, which is, in hindsight, kind of a crazy reason to pick a university, but it worked out well for me. While there, I picked up an interest in crime, mostly due to a single temporary professor who was a law professor, but he taught all kinds of classes aside from that. But on his law side, he represented a young woman who was, I think, 10 years old when she committed a really heinous murder. And at that time, it was possible to get the death penalty. And he fought to keep her from getting the death penalty and succeeded. And that really had an impact on me. Also, he taught things like research methods, even though, quite frankly, he didn't know much about methods. But what I learned from him was his passion for what he was doing. And I realized that if you're taking classes from someone who's passionate about what they're doing, you're going to learn something no matter what their background and skill level is in that area. Finished my undergrad degree. Couldn't find a job that really seemed interesting. And it turned out I was dating a girl who was 4 years younger than me, and she was from my hometown. And she decided to go to Indiana State University, but she didn't have a car. And so I'm finishing my undergrad as she's looking to go to college. And I decide, well, I'll drive her to orientation, and I can just hang around Indiana State University's campus while she's going through orientation. Get there. So I wander over to their criminology department, and the chair happens to be there, and we sit down and chat, and I walked out of the room with an assistantship for funding for the fall. I had no plan to go on for a master's. I was assigned to a brand new PhD who was passionate about what he was doing, and at one point he said to me, "You really like being a student, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I really do." He said, "Then you should be a professor. Because if you're a professor, you become a student for life as a career." I thought, well, that makes sense. And he said he had just finished his degree at Washington State University, and so on the other side of the country, where I'd never been. I had never traveled much when I was younger. And he said, I'll write a letter that I think will get you in because I'll make you sound like you walk on water, which clearly I don't. And I did get in, and I did get funding. And while there, I worked with some really amazing people like Jim Short, who became famous as a criminologist. And then it was time to, and my interest in drugs and crime continued, although I was in a sociology program, so criminology was kind of a minor side point in that program. That's true of many social programs. But I learned a lot about theory, I learned a lot about methods, and applied around the country. The job market was terrible at that time. But I got a job at Illinois State University, in part because, and by the way, my whole career has been one happy accident after another, in part because the chair at Illinois State University, where I was applying, was best friends with the professor who persuaded me to go on for a PhD. And I know that recommendation didn't hurt. So I got a job there, thinking maybe I would be there 5 years, only because nationally that was kind of the turnover for faculty. You move every few years and kind of move up. But I was very comfortable there. I found it a very good place to be because they emphasized both teaching and research. And I found the two together really was appealing to me. So instead of staying for 5 years, I've now been there for 41 years, a long time, and I still like it. It's still fun. I'm still a student. I still find things that I find interesting and challenging. And I'll retire one of these days. When I get up one morning and decide I just don't want to do this anymore, then I'll retire. But for the moment, it's a great life. And as a side note, no heavy lifting. No terrible factory conditions.
Okay.
But again, if you want to be a student, it's a great life. And you also have a freedom that you'd never have in a business. If you work for a major corporation doing research, your name would never be on the research. You would never pick the research topic. They would tell you what you're going to study. As an academic, you get to pick what you study. You get to pursue it. If you get tired of it, you can move on to a different topic. And when you produce things, your name is on it. You get some recognition for what you've done. So that was my early life. That was me. And again, I think I suggested, but I was a first generation student. So the world kind of happened to me by accident. I stumbled from one level to another in a good way. I will say I worked very hard. So my stumbling forward wasn't because people just handed me things. I had to work for it, but it was work I liked doing. So it wasn't really feeling like work. So then I'm at Illinois. I keep saying Indiana State. I'm at Illinois State University, and while I'm there, I still have an interest in drug issues, but don't quite know how to approach it. I do know, well, for one thing, that everything I'm seeing in the news, all the TV programs are all about big cities and drug problems in cities. And growing up in a smaller community, I knew that wasn't true, but I wasn't quite sure what to do about it. And then one day I'm watching the evening news. Here again, happy accident. And part of a career is taking advantage of accidents that happen, recognizing an opportunity and going with it. I'm watching the evening news, and the state police are making an arrest of a marijuana grower. Now, this marijuana grower is a farmer with bib overalls. He's got a son who's in his mid-20s who's also got bib overalls. And the state police had called in the local press, the TV station, to be there to record this because they saw this as a big deal. It was about 1,400 plants. This is well before legalization, so this is the kind of thing you can go to prison for a long time. And the press put a microphone in the young man's face and said, "Do you have any comment?" And the young man said, "I just want to tell everybody how professional the state police are." I'm thinking, who says that? Yeah. Certainly in urban areas, you would not expect that kind of response unless they were just giving you the business, if they were just playing with you. I went and talked to him later. I interviewed him. And he was that naive. I mean, I asked him, have you been in trouble with the law before? He goes, yeah, I have. And I said, well, tell me about it. He says, well, my dad has a heart issue. And he's got this medicine he takes when his heart starts acting up. And he was out of medicine. We're out in the barnyard and he's out of medicine. And I've got to go to town and get some. And I'm panicked because I don't want anything to happen to my dad. And I roll through a stop sign and I get pulled over by the police. And I go, yeah? He goes, well, that was my previous interaction with the law. I'm thinking, how does someone that naive about crime get involved in a... Oh, and I also asked him if he smoked marijuana. He goes, no. He said, I tried it once in high school and it made me cough and I thought it was awful. Yeah. So how does someone like that get involved in growing marijuana? And it turns out the farm was about to be lost to foreclosure because they were in desperate financial straits. The farmer had a high school friend who was in the drug business, who found out about the farmer's financial problems and said, look, if you grow it, I can market it and we can save your farm. So that got me really thinking about this. So I started digging, is there literature out there about growers? And there wasn't any. And so I started digging through newspaper stories about people being arrested. I started then thinking, well, this ought to be a project that's going to be big enough that I should get some funding. I need to travel to interview people. I want to talk to people. I don't want to make this just numbers. I want to talk to people. And I was putting together a grant proposal, and I wasn't quite sure where to send it because I was brand new about doing grant work. And it was such a different topic. Who would fund this? Certainly people or groups that would fund treatment things wouldn't necessarily fund it. And I wasn't sure what to do. And at that time, I was a brand new professor, and our department would have conferences in the spring. And if you volunteered to do a conference, you could decide what the theme would be and who you'd invite in as a guest speaker. And you'd have probation officers and cops and prison officials come in and hear the guest speaker, and then maybe you'd have some little panels on the side. And the guest speaker was Jim Inciardi, who at that time was probably the most extensively written person on the drug issue. And in fact, I think there was one year where he had 5 books come out. I mean, he was unbelievable. And I thought, oh, I'll ask Inciardi. We'll pay him money. He will come and do the presentation. And the night before the conference, his secretary calls and says, his mother is on her deathbed. He can't come to your conference. I'm a new person. I'm just learning about drug issues. I can't ask somebody to come in and speak the night before. I'm going to have to do it. I literally stay up the entire night working on a presentation that I'm sure was awful. It had to be awful because I was doing this on no sleep, really a weak background in terms of drug issues. Now I know much more, but I didn't then. And I survived. It happened. It went, but I'm sure it was awful. But I knew that Inciardi, he's a nice guy. What little I knew of him, he's a nice guy, and I knew he felt guilty about not being there. Well, it turned out we had money in the university. We could pay someone to look over a grant proposal and make recommendations about changing it, about where we'd submit. They don't have to come to us. We could send everything to them. So I thought, maybe he feels guilty enough that he would be willing to, because he's really busy. He's not going to do this to just anybody. And sure enough, he said, yeah, I'd be happy to look it over. And he made suggestions that ended up leading to funding from the National Institute of Justice. And he was kind of a mentor from that point on. I remember going to conferences dressing something like this, and he would say, you should be wearing a tie. Obviously, I'm not wearing a tie anyway. But that got funded. That really launched me into the study of marijuana growers in an environment where it was very much illegal. But in the process of doing that, I kept hearing these weird stories. You know, I interviewed a state trooper in Indiana because he'd made some grower arrests. And I said, well, talk about, one of your cases. Oh, he says, this guy, he had about 400 plants. And so I drove up to his house, and he was unloading firewood, and got out of my vehicle, and I said, hey, we found your 400 plants over the hill there. And well, we're going to have to arrest you. And the guy says, yeah, I know. He says, so I go on to help him unload the firewood. And then I tell him, look, get all your stuff together and turn yourself in the morning. Well, what urban cop show that you watch on TV does that, right? They never bust a drug dealer and say, show up at the police department tomorrow and we'll process you. And I kept hearing, so I started collecting anything I could find and started reading about rural crime, about which there was very little. And that then led to putting together, it was all together in piles. I had piles of news stories, of magazine stories that were examples. I had a few articles. I think there was a book or two written at the time that was not very thorough, quite frankly, but there's nothing to draw on to write the book. So I have all this, and at exactly that time, again, happy accident, the National Institute of Justice puts out a request for proposals for a study of rural policing, like $250,000, huge. And I'm thinking, I can't do $250,000 by myself, and I want this to really be good. So I had a colleague named Ed Wells who was a number cruncher. His idea of a good time was getting into big data sets and working with them. So he could deal with official, like, for example, crime data merged together with census data about areas where drug cultivation or where rural policing was maybe an issue to look at. And then I had another guy, Dave Falcone, who had been a cop. Well, he'll know the language of cops. When we're doing interviews with cops, right, he can help guide us in our language that we'd use. And so we ended up then doing this study that led to a book that's now, the last edition was a third edition, and we just kept kind of adding to it. And that kind of got me to where I am now. That also, by the way, led me, I have a book on methamphetamine, and that came about because I was at a conference like this, and NCRD saw me, and he said, you do rural stuff. Yeah. You do drugs. Yeah. Why aren't you studying methamphetamine? And I said, because methamphetamine, even meth users don't like meth. I said, marijuana was interesting to me because we have such conflicting feelings about it. But there's not much conflicting feeling about methamphetamine. He said, you need to study it. And so that generated research that led to a book on methamphetamine. So that's this twisting, winding path. People talk about, oh, you need a strategy, you need a 5-year plan. That would have never worked for me. Yeah. But I will say what did work was taking advantage of things that came up as possibilities and recognizing them as possibilities.
Yeah. It's happy little accidents.
Happy accidents.
Yeah.
It's never been a matter of, 5 years from now I'll be studying this topic. Yeah. Methamphetamine came out of the blue as a research area for me without any real planning.
Very interesting. Thank you for. You've covered quite a lot, how your trajectory of your career. So maybe I would ask instead, as someone almost pioneering some of the rural criminology and especially drug related crime, what was the major challenges perhaps for you, forward in this field, I would say maybe.
Major challenges, certainly one of them was being able to find a job. As I said, the job market was very tight. And also coming up with ideas would often be a challenge. Again, I would take advantage of things, but I would also have dry spells where, I need a project now and I can't quite decide what to do it on. And there might be 6 months where I just couldn't think of a new area because it had to be interesting to me. There are people who are very good at what they do who say, I do whatever there's funding for out there. Whatever there's a grant for, that will be my area. That's never been me. I think the word hedonist in terms of this might be accurate. It has to be interesting to me and it has to pique my curiosity. So there are those times when it's like, I just can't quite figure out what I'm going to do next. But again, as from the examples I gave, it's often a matter of happy accidents where things that would never have been planned, I never would have thought when I was starting out, where I ended up would have never been something I could have even imagined.
Right.
It's been a really good journey. And for young people thinking about it, I would say it's a little bit like if you decide you want to be a musician or you want to be an actor, you better not decide that unless you really like what you're doing, because it can be an area of frustration. It can be difficult and challenging. If you don't find it really interesting, then it's going to be tedious. It's not going to be interesting. You may want to find something else. But if it's interesting, then it's a great life. I mean, it's really rewarding. And again, a professional musician would tell you the same thing, that they have all these hurdles, but in the end, they love what they're doing. And you can't really ask for more than that, because how many of us know people who spend their time talking about how much they hate their work and how they can't wait to retire? I'm so grateful that that's never been an issue for me, because sometimes you have to do that, but it's great if you don't have to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So a little bit on that, like, so you talk about for new people in this field, like starting out their career. So what would you say then, like maybe something else that they should think about, or like something to motivate them to continue within rural criminology, for example?
Again, for me, part of it was also drawing on my own background. I knew what rural looked like, and I knew it wasn't what I was seeing when people were talking about crime, because it was always crime in the city. So certainly draw on what you know, draw on your background and use that. Try to also make connections to other people, other students even, who may be interested in areas that overlap with yours. The idea of collaborating is a really good thing to do and can take you on a topic in directions you may not have thought of.
Right.
And it benefits both of you, or if there's more than two. But two is kind of the ideal starting point, because you have to negotiate things like, oh, we wrote an article, now who gets to be first author? And that can be contentious sometimes. And oftentimes you're best off talking about that from the very beginning.
Right.
So look, if we do this, I'll do this part, you do that part, I'll be first author on this one. If we have a second one, you'll be first author. But working with other people is a great thing also. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I also would like to ask you, since you've had several decades studying this field, like, what would you say, like, rural criminology is to you? Like, what defines it a bit for you?
To me, it's studying rural is an avenue for better understanding crime in general. Because if things that are true in cities are not true in rural, that tells you something about our theories. Our theories need to be able to do both. I did a paper with a number cruncher colleague of mine, in which we looked at homicide patterns by county in the U.S. and what were some of the social demographic variables that went along with homicides. So unemployment rate, income, those sorts of things. And what we found was that those kinds of things really did a good job of predicting homicides in urban counties, but were almost worthless in rural. And that's got to get you thinking, why would that be true? If our theories are any good, they should work in both places. And they don't. So for me, the thing about rural that's appealing is it makes you ask bigger questions. That rural may be interesting and important all by itself, but it can lead to a better understanding of crime in general. And by the way, I'm always fascinated when people talk about, oh, they did a study in Los Angeles. And then there's assumption that whatever they found in Los Angeles is going to apply to New York and Chicago. But in rural, for theories to be tested, you have to have variability. If everybody in your sample is male, you can't talk about, there's a gender difference in homicide. Doesn't make any sense. One thing about rural is it is huge in variability. it is huge in terms, if you look at, again, going to the United States as an example, which is what I know the best, but this will be true everywhere. For example, the issue of race. Huge variability in the percent of the population that is minority, at a range of variability that goes beyond, and you include that with income, types of occupations. There's so many different things that in rural there's a huge variability that lets you look at theories in a way you couldn't necessarily do if you just focused on urban. So that makes rural interesting to me.
Right.
That beyond, it's cute and interesting and you tell great stories about rural, but in the end, it's the bigger implications that make it important.
Right. Yeah, so like the importance of context a bit for crime, I think it really shows up in this urban and rural.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Context is so important, and sometimes we forget that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And especially since you talked about knowing like the North American context the best, but it's also like how we say about the global South and global North divided and the rural areas in those areas and urban areas in those areas, how they differ also.
And by the way, I think that's probably the most interesting or exciting direction for rural right now, is looking at outside of the U.S., because as much variability as there is within the U.S., it gets even bigger when you start moving beyond. And that's really an exciting chapter. I'm looking forward to seeing how people fill that in and work on that.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about that. Like, where do you see the field? How it will develop? Maybe like in a 20-year time frame, how would you see how that would develop?
I think that that global description right now, it's really United States, Australia, England, little bits and pieces in other countries, but it needs to be more than that. It needs to be spread through very different kinds of cultures, very different kinds of political systems. Go down the list. So that's where I think you're going to see a lot of the really interesting developments.
Okay. And we look forward, maybe a last look back, then if you would look back at 20-year-old Ralph,
Yes.
and what would you say to him? Like, what kind of advice would you say? Or,
I would say you're going to be a really lucky guy because some really happy coincidences happened that led you to the path that you're on. It's great for people who can plan and carefully, map out their future. For me, that would have never worked, but you have to kind of do what works for you.
Yeah.
And what reflects kind of your personality. And I think that's an important thing for students also. Don't try to be what you're not. If you're not interested in illegal drugs, don't make that an area unless you just feel you have to, because I'm a doctoral student and I'm working for a guy who does drug research. Go and do that. But if that's not your real interest, don't limit yourself to that when you get out, when you finish your degree. Move on to those things that you have some passion about.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Like, before we conclude, maybe do you have any final thoughts or words that you want to share to our audience? Or
not only that it really is a great career, and there are so many things about it that just make it a step above many other things you could be doing. But again, you have to love what you're doing. So some people love being accountants. If you love being an accountant, be an accountant. Don't go into academics unless you really like being a student.
Yeah.
You won't be happy.
Yeah.
and being happy is so important.
Yeah. Sure.
And that's it.
Thank you very much. It was a really interesting conversation, hearing about your trajectory, about this little accidents that led you to where you are today also. But yes, thank you very much. Once again, thank you to the audience for listening to this interview, and stay tuned for future very interesting insights also. And we'll stay tuned till then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.